In 1993, German archaeologists recovered a notebook worth an estimated $50,000 in historical value from a sealed medieval cesspit in Erfurt, a latrine buried for 700 years. Inside, your eyes would find classical Latin script, elegant and scholarly. But here's what experts still can't explain: why would someone deliberately destroy such a carefully written text by throwing it into an outhouse, and how did it possibly survive? In the worst possible environment for paper to survive? For 7 centuries, that notebook has sat in a museum defying every rule of medieval literacy, geography, and basic human behavior. They're not expecting much. Cesspits occasionally yield leather scraps, broken pottery, discarded bones. The usual debris of a medieval life. But somewhere in that compacted, anaerobic darkness, a conservator's tool meets something that shouldn't be there. A notebook. Small enough to fit in a palm. Made of wax-filled wooden leaves, bound together, the kind of writing instrument the Romans called a *pugilare star. And the writing pressed into it is not a shopping list. It is not a prayer in rough church Latin. It is classical Latin. Careful, structured, almost elegant. The question that opens immediately, and has never fully closed, is this: what was a pristine classical Latin notebook doing at the bottom of a German privy in the 13th century? To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Erfurt was in the medieval period, and what it was not. By the 1200s, Erfurt was a prosperous trading town in the Thuringian basin. It had guilds, markets, a growing merchant class. It would eventually host one of the earliest universities in the German-speaking world. But in the 13th century, that university did not yet exist. The intellectual centers of Germany were cathedral schools and monasteries, and they taught Latin, but a particular kind of Latin. Liturgical. Abbreviated. Functional for prayer and administration, not styled after Cicero. Classical Latin, the Latin of Caesar, of Virgil, of the Roman legal tradition, was a different discipline. It required immersion in texts that were rare, expensive, and almost exclusively held by the most elite ecclesiastical libraries in Europe. To write it fluently, you needed years of training of a kind that, in a German market town in the 1200s, had almost no institutional home. And yet here it is. In a cesspit. Now here's where the official story starts to fracture. The first assumption most people make, and it seems reasonable, is that this notebook belonged to a cleric. A wandering scholar, perhaps. Someone educated at a cathedral school who passed through Erfurt, lost or discarded a writing tablet, and moved on. Neat. Tidy. Case closed. But the next detail changes everything. The notebook wasn't loose in the pit. It was found in a context suggesting it had been there a long time, not dropped recently before the pit was sealed, but present, preserved, through centuries of anaerobic compression. And its condition was described by conservators as remarkably intact. Not rotted. Not dissolved. The wax had survived in a way that organic materials in cesspits occasionally do, precisely because the sealed, airless, wet environment can paradoxically preserve certain objects better than open air. But the condition of the Latin inside raises a harder question: if this was a working notebook, a student's tablet, a scholar's draft, why does the writing bear the marks of deliberate, formal composition rather than hasty notes? Wax tablets were the scratch paper of the ancient and medieval world. You wrote on them, read them, smoothed them flat, and wrote again. They were ephemeral by design. You didn't compose careful classical Latin in a wax notebook you planned to throw away. Unless you were practicing. Unless this was an exercise, a deliberate attempt to replicate a classical style. And if it was an exercise, who was the teacher? 3 threads in the archive records I've kept on this case pull in. Directions most summaries don't follow, and the third one is the strangest. The first thread is linguistic. The Latin in the Erfurt notebook doesn't match the abbreviation-heavy, formula-driven Latin of 13th-century German ecclesiastical writing. Specialists who examined it noted structural features more consistent with late antique or Carolingian era models, texts that were being deliberately studied and imitated. This narrows the possible authors considerably. You're not looking for a parish priest. You're looking for someone with access to a specific curriculum. The second thread is material. The *pugillaris* format, multiple wax-filled leaves bound together, was a Roman instrument that had largely fallen out of use by the high medieval period in Germany. Single wax tablets persisted. Bound notebooks of this type were increasingly rare. Finding one in 13th century Erfurt is, on its own, an anomaly. Finding one with this quality of Latin inside compounds the anomaly significantly. But the third thread, and this is the one that was quietly set aside in the official reports, is locational. The cesspit in which this notebook was found was not beneath a church. It was not beneath a monastery or a known ecclesiastical building. The excavation site placed it beneath what was, in the medieval period, a secular urban property. A merchant district. The kind of neighborhood where Latin learning of this caliber had no obvious explanation. Few who've studied this object have lingered on that detail. But it matters, because it removes the easiest answer. This wasn't a cleric's latrine. It was, as far as the archaeological record shows, a civilian one. So who wrote it? Here's what the evidence actually supports, stripped of comfortable assumptions. Erfurt in the 13th century was not just a German market town. It was a significant node in European trade routes, and it had a Jewish intellectual community that, in this period, maintained traditions of textual scholarship, including, in some cases, engagement with Latin texts for legal and commercial purposes. It also had connections to the wider world of itinerant scholars, the *wandering students* known as *Goliads*, young men moving between cathedral schools across Europe, sometimes carrying writing materials, sometimes falling into poverty, sometimes disappearing entirely from the record. Both populations are possible authors. Neither is certain. What the Erfurt notebook resists is the tidy explanation. It resists the wandering cleric story because of the location. It resists the student exercise story because of the quality. It resists the merchant record story because the content is not commercial. In the records I've kept on medieval material culture, this object occupies a category I describe as the deliberate anomaly, the thing that was made with intention, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and that ended up precisely where it should never have been found. Now consider what the cesspit itself tells us. Preservation in an anaerobic pit is not accidental. Objects that survive in these conditions do so because of specific chemical circumstances: low oxygen, stable moisture, absence of the biological agents that destroy organic material in open air. The notebook's survival suggests it was deposited in the pit at a specific moment and then sealed. Which means someone put it there. Or it was lost there. Or, and this is the possibility the official record treats most lightly, it was hidden there. Cesspits were, in the medieval period, occasionally used as places of concealment. Not often. Not comfortably. But a sealed underground shaft, inaccessible and repellent, is a logical place to put something you don't want found. The Jewish community of Erfurt, it should be noted, was subjected to significant persecution in this period. Documents, objects, and texts were not always safe to keep in plain sight. That is not a conclusion. It is a direction the evidence permits. And directions the evidence permits are sometimes the most important ones to name. What remains, then, is this: a small wax notebook. Classical Latin. A secular urban cesspit. A German market town in the 13th century with no obvious institutional home for this kind of learning. And a preservation so complete it strikes conservators as almost improbable. The Erfurt Pugillaris hasn't been lost. It's been catalogued, studied, and discussed in specialist literature. But specialist literature has a way of containing mysteries rather than resolving them, filing the anomaly under *unusual find, origin uncertain *, and moving on. What I've found in the archives, again and again, is that the objects which resist easy categorization are the ones that carry the most information. Not because they are supernatural. Not because they require a conspiracy. But because they sit at the intersection of things we thought we understood: medieval literacy, Roman material culture, urban life in 13th century Germany, and reveal that the intersection is stranger than the maps suggest. The notebook was not supposed to survive. The Latin was not supposed to be there. The location was not supposed to make sense. 7 centuries later, it still doesn't, not completely. If you want to go deeper on medieval objects that broke the rules they were supposed to follow, the next record is already waiting.